It began on a Tuesday afternoon, the sort of afternoon that settles softly on the world like dust. The air was dry, the sunlight slanted through my lace curtains, and the kettle hissed faintly on the stove. Most days in my little cottage passed like that, quiet, predictable, almost invisible. Since retiring from teaching, I had learned to measure time not by the clock but by the sound of the postman's footsteps at the gate. That day the footsteps were different, lighter, less hurried. When I opened the door, the man standing there wasn't the usual gray-haired postman I'd known for years. This one was young, perhaps 25, with a sun-touched face and eyes that held a kind of restless curiosity. His uniform looked too new for him, the cap slightly crooked, and the satchel across his chest seemed to weigh more than he did. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, holding out a small bundle of letters. His voice was polite but unsure, as if he was still getting used to speaking to strangers in uniform. "Good afternoon," I replied, taking the letters. "New to the route?" "Yes," he said, smiling a little. "Just started this week. Mr. Hughes is on leave." "Well, I hope they're treating you kindly," I said. "It's not an easy job walking in this heat." He laughed, a quick, genuine laugh that seemed to ripple through the still air. "I don't mind it. Better than sitting inside all day." Something in that laughter made me smile more warmly than I'd intended. He tipped his cap, wished me a good day and left. I stood at the doorway longer than I should have, watching him walk down the lane. The sunlight caught the back of his uniform, outlining him against the dusty road until he disappeared beyond the hedges. That night, as I sat reading beside the lamp, I found myself thinking about him, the new postman with the careful smile. It wasn't attraction, not in the way the world might think. It was something gentler, older, curiosity mixed with an unexpected warmth. For years, I had lived within the quiet rhythm of my solitude. Now suddenly the world outside my gate felt alive again. The next morning I set 2 cups on the table instead of 1 before catching myself. I chuckled at my own foolishness and poured only 1 cup of tea. Still, I caught myself listening for his steps again, though the post didn't arrive until afternoon. When he came by the second time, I was in the garden, pruning the roses. He greeted me with that same shy smile. "Beautiful garden you have, sir," he said. "Thank you," I replied. "It gives me something to do." He leaned against the gate for a moment, eyes moving over the flowers. "My grandmother used to grow roses like these. She said they were stubborn plants, needed patience." "She was right," I said. "But if you care for them long enough, they reward you." He looked up at me, perhaps catching something in my tone. "I suppose that's true of most things," he said. That small exchange stayed with me long after he'd gone. I realized as I watched him walk away again, that our conversations, brief as they were, had already started to mean something to me. After years of routine silence, there was now a voice that broke the stillness. On Thursday he delivered a parcel that required a signature. When I opened the door, he hesitated before handing it over. "I hope I'm not disturbing your afternoon," he said. "Not at all," I answered. "You're probably the most interesting part of it." He blushed faintly, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable need to reassure him. "Why don't you come in for a glass of water? It's awfully warm." He hesitated, polite, uncertain, but finally nodded. Inside he looked around the small sitting room, taking in the shelves of books, the photographs on the mantel, the quiet order of a life lived mostly alone. "You live here by yourself?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "For some years now." He nodded slowly, tracing his fingers along the back of the old armchair before sitting down. "It's peaceful here," he said. "The town feels busy sometimes, but this," he gestured around, "it feels calm." "That's one word for it," I said with a smile. "Another might be lonely." He looked at me, then really looked, not with pity but with something softer. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But sometimes peace is worth the loneliness." That line lingered between us like a faint perfume. When he left a few minutes later, I found the glass still half full on the table. I didn't wash it right away. Instead, I sat in the chair he'd occupied, feeling the ghost of conversation still hanging in the air. By the end of the week, I had begun to anticipate his arrival like the changing of light through the window. I caught myself arranging the room before he came, setting the kettle to boil, sweeping the porch, choosing a book to leave open on the table as though I might appear more interesting. It was foolish, I knew, but there was joy in the foolishness. On Friday, the post arrived later than usual. I had almost given up when I heard his voice at the gate. "Sorry, sir. Long route today." I opened the door, feigning surprise. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me." He laughed, a sound that seemed to fill the empty rooms. "Never. You're my favorite stop, though I probably shouldn't say that. I wanted to ask why, but before I could, he said, you actually talk to me. Most people just take their letters and shut the door. Then we'll make that our tradition, I said. You bring the letters and I'll provide the conversation. He grinned, nodding. Deal. That night, the wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes. I sat at my desk and took out one of the empty envelopes he'd delivered. On impulse, I wrote his name on it, Daniel, Postman, and beneath it a small note. Thank you for bringing a little life back to this old house. Of course, I didn't send it. I slipped the note into the drawer and told myself I'd throw it away in the morning. But I didn't. A week later, Daniel came again. Looks like you've got more letters this time, he said, sorting through his bag. Business or boredom, I replied. Hard to tell which. He smiled, then added softly, I like coming here. You remind me of my grandfather. He used to tell stories while I helped him with chores. I was a teacher, I said. Stories are what kept my students awake. Maybe you'll tell me one sometime, he said, eyes bright with genuine interest. Maybe I will, I answered, and for the first time in years I meant it. That evening, after he left, I found myself sitting by the window long after sunset, listening to the crickets outside. The house was still but no longer silent in the same way. Somewhere in that stillness, I could hear the faint echo of a young man's laughter, the creak of the gate, the steady rhythm of footsteps fading down the lane. I realized then that life, even after all these quiet years, still had the power to surprise me, sometimes in the simplest form. A new postman at my door, a kind voice, and the smallest spark of something I hadn't dared to feel in a very long time. The days began to fold into one another after that first week, each one carrying a quiet anticipation I hadn't known for years. I tried not to name it, that small, glowing feeling that came every time I heard the soft click of the gate or the rustle of footsteps along the path. But the truth was simple. I had started to wait for Daniel. Sometimes I would pretend not to notice when he arrived, staying at my desk or in the garden, letting him call out before I turned. I told myself it was politeness, that I didn't want to seem too eager, but inside I knew it was shyness. A part of me feared that my small, growing fondness might show too plainly in my face. One morning I found him leaning against the gate, sorting letters from his bag. The sun caught the edge of his hair, and I realized how young he really was. An age where life still seemed to stretch endlessly forward. He noticed me watching and smiled. You always have the tittiest garden on this street, he said. It's like something out of an old postcard. It's a teacher's habit, I replied. Everything must be in order, even the roses. He grinned. Then I'll make sure to deliver the letters neatly too. Wouldn't want to ruin your system. You're doing fine, I said, then added after a pause, you seem to like your work. I do, he said, nodding. I like walking. Seeing people. Simple, I guess. Honest work. The way he said honest struck me. There was no pride in it, just quiet certainty. It reminded me of how I once felt about teaching. That sense of doing something real, however small. The following week, Daniel's visits grew longer. Sometimes he lingered to chat, or I'd find some excuse to keep him talking. Offering a glass of lemonade, asking about the weather, even pretending to have misplaced my pen just to make him wait a little longer. One afternoon, he brought a small package and stood by the door longer than usual. I've been reading one of your recommendations, he said suddenly. The one you mentioned last time, The Old Man and the Sea. I blinked in surprise. You actually picked it up? Yeah, he said, smiling shyly. You talked about it like it mattered. So I thought I should see why. Well, I said, trying to sound casual. Did it? He laughed softly. It's sad. But in a good way. Makes you think about trying even when there's no guarantee you'll win. That's the point, I said. The effort itself is the victory. He nodded, thoughtful. You know, I didn't expect to talk about books while delivering mail. Nor did I admitted. But life has a strange way of surprising us. He smiled again, that kind of smile that starts small but reaches the eyes. For a moment I forgot about the heat, the ticking clock, the distance between our years. There was only that feeling of quiet recognition, as if two parts of a story had finally found each other's page. I began to notice things about him. The way he always carried a small notebook in his pocket, the way his fingers brushed the edges of letters like they were something sacred, the small crease between his brows when he concentrated. He had a restlessness about him, like someone who'd seen just enough of the world to know there was more waiting. Once, as he handed me a letter, he said, You ever wish you could just start over somewhere new? I looked at him, surprised. Start over? At my age? He shrugged, a little sheepish. Not because of age. Just because sometimes you feel stuck, you know? Like there's a whole world out there you're not part of. I used to, I said quietly. But I've learned that the world has a way of coming to your door when you least expect it. He tilted his head slightly as if considering my words. Then very softly he said, maybe it already has. I didn't know what to say to that. My heart gave a small, uncertain stir, not out of shock, but from the realization that perhaps he felt the same strange connection I did. That evening I found myself writing again. I wrote about him, not his name, not his job, just the feeling. The way his voice lingered after he left, the way silence seemed heavier on the days he didn't come. I wasn't in love, not yet, it wasn't that simple. It was more like remembering how to feel again after years of numbness. The next day it rained lightly, not a storm, just a thin mist that softened the world. Daniel came as usual, coat damp, cheeks flushed from the walk. I almost skipped your stop, he teased, shaking water from his cap, but then I thought you'd scold me. I would've, I said. I look forward to my mail too much these days. He smiled at that, eyes crinkling. Even the bills? Even the bills, I said, and we both laughed. He stepped just inside the doorway to avoid the rain, and for a brief moment, the space between us felt charged with something unspoken. I could smell the damp wool of his coat, hear the soft rhythm of the rain against the window. He was close enough that I could see the faint tremble in his fingers as he adjusted his satchel. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was full, expectant, like standing on the edge of something new. The following week he told me more about himself. How he'd grown up in a small town by the sea. How he'd come here looking for something different, though he wasn't sure what that was. I listened, not interrupting, letting his voice fill the spaces my own loneliness had carved out over the years. When he asked about me, I told him bits and pieces, how I'd taught literature for 30 years, how I'd lived alone since retiring, how the house had grown too quiet. He listened the way my students once did, with genuine attention as if each word mattered. I think I'd have liked to be your student, he said after a pause. You make everything sound like it has meaning. Everything does, I said softly. We just forget to notice. He looked at me then, really looked, and something in that gaze made my breath catch. It wasn't romantic yet, not fully, but it was close. It was recognition. Affection. A quiet warmth that needed no words. That night I lay awake thinking about him. Not in the way of infatuation but with a kind of gentle wonder. I thought about the way he tilted his head when he listened, the way his laughter made the room feel less hollow. I wondered what he thought when he left my gate each day. Did he think of me too? Or was I just another stop on his route? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for certain. Something had shifted in me. The loneliness that had once felt like a permanent fixture had begun to crack. Through those small moments, a smile, a shared silence, a simple conversation, life was finding its way back in. The next morning as I waited for his arrival, I caught myself straightening my collar in the mirror. The gesture startled me. I laughed under my breath, half in embarrassment, half in delight. It had been years since I'd cared how I looked for anyone. And yet, for reasons I didn't dare to name, I wanted to look my best for Daniel. It had been raining since morning, a soft, steady drizzle that turned the garden soil dark and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. I had always liked the rain, though it made the house feel smaller somehow, as if the walls leaned in to listen to the sound of the drops. On most days I would make tea, sit by the window and watch the road blur behind the curtain of water. That day, however, I found myself restless. The rain kept me from walking into town and the silence felt different, expectant, almost charged. I knew Daniel would still come, he was dependable like that. Still, I couldn't help but worry about him out there in the cold, his satchel growing damp, his cap dripping with rain. By the time I heard the faint creak of the gate, my heart was already beating faster. I opened the door before he could knock. He stood there, soaked through, rainwater glistening on his hair, his uniform clinging to his shoulders. For a moment he just smiled, sheepishly, apologetically. "Afternoon, sir," he said. "Sorry for the mess. The weather's not kind today." "You look half drowned," I said, stepping aside. "Come in quickly." He hesitated, perhaps unsure whether it was proper, but then nodded and stepped inside. The rain roared louder as I closed the door behind him, shutting us into the soft dimness of the house. I fetched a towel from the hallway and handed it to him. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now. He ran the towel through his hair, laughing under his breath. "I look terrible, don't I?" "You look like someone who's done his job well," I said, trying not to sound as fond as I felt. "Sit by the fire, you'll catch a chill." He obeyed, sinking into the chair nearest the fireplace. The flames cast a golden light across his face, softening his features. I busied myself with the kettle, but I kept glancing at him, at the way his eyes followed the fire, at how comfortable he looked in my home despite the weather outside. "Do you ever get lonely here?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I've grown used to my own company." He nodded slowly. "I know that feeling. Moving here was supposed to be a fresh start, but some days it feels like I left more behind than I found." "Family?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "A bit of everything. I've got people back home, but it's not the same anymore. Life changes faster than we think." I understood that. I had spent years adjusting to the quiet after my retirement, to the absence of voices that once filled my days. I wanted to tell him that loneliness didn't always fade. Sometimes it simply learned to live beside you, but I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud. Instead, I poured us both tea. He took his cup with both hands, fingers reddened from the cold. "You make good tea," he said after a sip, smiling faintly. "I've had years of practice," I replied. "It's one of the few skills that improves with solitude." He laughed, soft, warm like the first patch of sunlight after a storm. "You always know how to say things that sound wiser than they should." "That's the teacher in me," I said. "And the poet maybe," he added, teasing. I looked at him, a little startled. "Poet?" He shrugged, eyes glinting. "You talk like someone who writes things down." "Do you?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "Old habits. Letters mostly. To no one in particular." He seemed to think about that. "Maybe one day you'll write one to me." It was said lightly, almost playfully, but something about it made the room feel warmer. I didn't know how to respond, so I smiled instead. Outside, the rain beat harder against the windows, like fingers tapping on glass. After a while, the storm eased into a gentle drizzle. Daniel leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed, the firelight flickering over his face. His cap sat on the table beside him, damp and wrinkled. I realized he must have been exhausted, walking in the rain all morning, carrying a satchel full of letters for people who barely looked up when he handed them over. "You can rest a bit if you'd like," I said softly. "No one will mind if the mail is a few minutes late." He opened one eye, smiling. "You sure?" "Quite sure." He nodded, the smallest of sighs escaping his lips, and before long his breathing grew slower, steadier. He had fallen asleep in the chair, the fire reflecting gently in his hair. I sat quietly across from him, the ticking of the clock the only sound between us. There was something strangely peaceful about watching him like that, the trust of it, perhaps. To fall asleep in a stranger's house, to let the world pause for a moment. It reminded me of a time long ago when I'd watch my students doze off during afternoon study sessions, their heads resting on their arms. That same mix of affection and protectiveness filled me now. After what felt like an hour, he stirred. "How long was I out?" he murmured, rubbing his eyes. "Not long," I said. "You looked like you needed it." He smiled sleepily. "Guess I did. Thank you for letting me stay." "You're always welcome here," I said, and meant it more deeply than he could know. He looked at me for a long moment, then, his expression unreadable, somewhere between gratitude and curiosity. I felt the air shift again, as if the space between us had grown smaller without either of us moving. "I should go," he said finally, standing. The reins lightened up. "Let me walk you to the door." At the threshold, he turned back, his hand resting on the frame. "You know," he said quietly, "I don't think this town feels so lonely anymore." I smiled. "That makes two of us." He gave a small nod as if committing the words to memory, then stepped out into the damp evening. I watched him walk down the lane, his figure growing smaller with each step until the mist swallowed him whole. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing his voice in my head, that line, simple and honest, "I don't think this town feels so lonely anymore." I wondered if he'd meant it for the town or for me. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of footsteps on wet stone, of laughter near the garden gate, of letters arriving not just with words but with warmth. For the first time in years, the sound of the rain no longer felt like an echo. It felt like a promise. The days after the rain felt lighter somehow, as though the air itself had changed. The garden smelled sweeter, the morning seemed brighter, and even the rhythm of the postman's footsteps on the gravel seemed to fall in tune with my heartbeat. Daniel had begun to visit more often now. Not always for letters, sometimes he came just to talk. And I, despite all my attempts at restraint, found myself waiting for him in ways I hadn't waited for anyone in years. One morning, I was trimming the hedges when I saw him coming down the lane, his satchel swinging gently at his side. He waved before I could call out. "Morning, sir," he said cheerfully. "You're always up so early." "Habit," I replied. "Old teachers rise with the sun whether they have classes or not." He grinned. "An old postman too, apparently." I laughed softly. "Then perhaps we share more in common than we thought." He leaned against the gate, eyes bright beneath the brim of his cap. "You make it sound like fate." "Maybe it is," I said without thinking, and then realizing how that might sound, quickly added, "Fate has a fondness for routine." He chuckled, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a spark of something unspoken. After that, his visits became longer. Sometimes he'd help me carry groceries from the corner shop. Other times he'd sit on the porch while I told him stories from my teaching days. He was curious about everything, about the books I read, the students I'd taught, even the roses in the garden. "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" he asked once as he helped me water the plants. I looked at him over the rim of the watering can. "Alone doesn't always mean lonely." "But it can," he said quietly, glancing down at his hands. "Yes," I admitted. "It can." He looked up again, smiling faintly. "Then maybe I'll have to keep you company just in case." There was humor in his voice, but also sincerity, the kind that makes a person's heart tremble without warning. One afternoon he arrived with a small paper bag. "For you," he said, placing it on the table. I opened it to find a warm loaf of bread inside. "From the bakery near the post office," he explained. "You mentioned you liked fresh bread and I thought, well, you shouldn't have to bake every day." I was touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged, smiling. "I wanted to." The bread smelled heavenly, and when we sat down to eat it with butter and tea, the house felt alive again, not just filled with sound but with presence. His laughter lingered in the corners like sunlight that refused to fade. Over the following weeks, our talks deepened. I learned that Daniel had studied art for a while before life had forced him to find steadier work. He still carried a small sketchbook in his satchel, and sometimes he'd show me drawings of the town, rooftops under the evening sky, the curve of the bridge, the quiet street where I lived. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I asked, "Have you ever drawn people?" "Not much," he said. "It feels too personal." "And yet," I said, smiling gently, "you draw towns, and towns are full of people." He looked at me thoughtful. "Maybe I'll draw you sometime," he said finally. I raised an eyebrow. "An old man sitting among roses?" He laughed. "An old man who sees more beauty than most young ones ever will." That line stayed with me long after he left. I could still hear the warmth in his voice as I walked through the quiet house later that evening. Sometimes I caught myself wondering what others might think if they saw us together. A retired teacher and a young postman sharing tea, laughter, and something that hovered delicately between friendship and something deeper. But I didn't let the thought linger. The world outside could remain as it was. What mattered was the quiet, private universe that seemed to grow between us with every visit. One late afternoon, as I was sorting through old letters in the study, Daniel arrived without his satchel. He looked different, lighter, as if he'd left his duties behind for a while. "No deliveries today?" I asked. "Half day," he said, smiling. And I thought, well, I'd rather spend the rest of it here. I pretended to focus on the papers, though my heart had already betrayed me. "You might find it dull. Old letters and older stories." "Then maybe you'll tell me one," he said, taking a seat across from me. And I did. I told him about the students who'd written me letters after graduation, about the friend I'd lost touch with years ago, about the moments when I'd felt both proud and painfully human. He listened without interruption, eyes steady, his hands folded on the table. When I finished, he was silent for a long while. "You must have meant a lot to them," he said finally. "I hope so," I replied. "But time has a way of softening even the strongest connections." He shook his head slightly. "Not all of them." There was something in the way he said it, quiet but firm, that made my throat tighten. As the months drifted on, Daniel's presence became a kind of rhythm in my life. He'd bring small things, a newspaper, a flower from the roadside, a sketch, each one left behind like a gentle reminder that someone out there cared. And in return I found myself doing the same. I'd bake an extra loaf, leave a note tucked into an envelope for him to find later, write a small poem about the day. Neither of us ever spoke of what was happening between us, but we didn't need to. The affection lived in gestures, in the silence between sentences, in the way our eyes met and looked away again just a heartbeat too late. One evening, as the last light faded, Daniel lingered by the door before leaving. "You know," he said softly, "sometimes I think this house feels like home." "Maybe it's because you've made it warmer," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression caught somewhere between gratitude and confusion, as if he wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. Finally he just nodded and stepped out into the dusk. I watched him go until the shadows swallowed him. For a long while I stood there listening to the wind move through the trees, realizing that my solitude, once so comfortable, had become unbearable on the days he didn't come. That night I sat by the window with a blank page before me. I wrote a simple line at the top. There are people who arrive like morning light, quietly, gently, and all at once the room changes. Then I stopped, afraid to write his name beneath it. It was late summer when the air began to change. The evenings stretched longer, and the garden glowed with that golden light that makes everything feel softer, almost dreamlike. The roses had begun to fade, their petals loosening one by one, and the scent of the earth carried a faint melancholy. I suppose that's how I felt too, aware of beauty, and of the quiet sadness that comes when you know it cannot last forever. Daniel had been visiting regularly now, though he no longer needed a reason. Some days he still brought mail, other times he came empty-handed, claiming he was just passing by. I never called him out on the lie. We both knew he came because he wanted to, and that was enough. One evening I was sitting on the porch when he arrived, not in uniform this time, but in a soft gray shirt and worn jeans. The sight of him like that, casual, unguarded, sent a flutter through me that I tried to hide. "You're off duty," I said. "For once," he replied, smiling. "And I thought I'd spend my free hour here if that's all right." "You never have to ask," I said. "There's tea on the stove." He followed me inside. The sunlight pooled in the kitchen, painting his face in gold and shadow. He poured the tea for both of us, which had become his small ritual lately, and we carried the cups to the porch. We sat in silence for a while, watching the light change. I could hear the hum of crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the slow rhythm of our breathing. There was comfort in that quiet, the kind that feels like understanding. He was the first to speak. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, his voice low, "about how some people cross paths at exactly the right time." "Oh," I said, turning to look at him. He nodded, staring into his cup. "When I moved here I didn't expect much. Just another job, another small town. But then I met you." I smiled softly, though my heart was suddenly beating too fast. "And what did you expect to find here, Daniel?" He looked up at me then. "Not this," he said simply. The way he said it, quiet, almost reverent, made my breath catch. There was something raw in his eyes, something I had seen growing there for weeks but hadn't dared to name. "I don't quite know what this is," I said after a long pause. "Whatever we have, it's been unexpected. But it's meant something to me." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's meant something to me too. More than I thought it would." The words hung between us, fragile and real. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, not excitement, not even hope, but relief. Relief that the quiet affection I had tried to hide had not been entirely one-sided. He continued softly, "You probably think it's strange. Me always showing up. Staying longer than I should." "I don't think it's strange," I said. "I think it's kind." He smiled faintly. "Kindness isn't what keeps me coming here." The evening deepened into twilight. Fireflies began to spark along the hedges, and a thin breeze brushed past us. I could hear the creak of the old porch boards as Daniel shifted slightly closer. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "why people find each other at certain moments? Like maybe there's a reason?" "I used to," I said. "Now I just accept it when it happens." He looked at me for a long time, too long, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. There was no mistaking it anymore. The tenderness in it, the quiet admiration, the way it reached me like warmth through glass. I looked away first, pretending to watch the fireflies. "You're young," I said. "You still have your whole life ahead of you. You don't need." He interrupted gently. "Don't tell me what I need." There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. He shifted a little closer again and I could see the flicker of his pulse at his throat. "You think I don't know what this is?" he said softly. "But I do. Maybe better than you think." The air between us felt different then, charged, alive. I could feel every heartbeat echo in the silence. "Daniel," I began, "you don't owe me anything. I never wanted." He cut me off again, his tone quiet but insistent. "You've never asked me for anything. That's what makes it different." I swallowed hard. The words I wanted to say tangled in my chest. I had spent years building walls around my heart, convincing myself that such feelings were long behind me, that affection like this was for other people, younger people, braver people. And yet here it was sitting beside me, breathing real. Finally I said, If you knew how long it's been since I let someone this close. He smiled gently. Then maybe it's time you did. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for my teacup, my hands trembling slightly, and found that he had already set his aside. His fingers brushed mine light as a whisper. Neither of us moved. When I finally met his eyes again, something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was quiet, inevitable, like the tide returning to shore. For a long moment we just sat there looking at each other as if the rest of the world had gone still. He spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. I care about you. More than I probably should. I let out a shaky breath. And what am I supposed to say to that? Say whatever's true. I hesitated, then said the only thing I could. That I care about you too. The words felt strange on my tongue, unfamiliar, vulnerable, but they were true. And when I said them, I saw something in him soften, something like relief mixed with quiet joy. We didn't speak much after that. He stayed until the sky turned from gold to blue to deep indigo. When he finally rose to leave, he lingered by the door, his hand resting on the frame the way it always did. I'll see you tomorrow? He asked. Yes, I said. Tomorrow. But before he stepped outside, he turned back and added, almost shyly, I'm glad you didn't send me away. I smiled. I couldn't even if I tried. He nodded once and then he was gone, down the path, through the gate, into the darkening street. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore, until the sound of his footsteps faded completely. That night I sat at my desk and opened a blank page. The words came easily this time. Sometimes the heart doesn't shout when it finds what it's been missing. It whispers, softly enough that only the right person hears. When I finished writing, I folded the page and placed it in an empty envelope. I didn't write his name on it, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly who it was for. The following day arrived wrapped in a kind of stillness, as if the whole town had paused to hold its breath. The sky was the pale gray of early autumn. The first leaves had begun to fall, brushing across the cobblestones outside my window. I found myself pacing the house, unable to read, unable to focus on anything but the memory of last night, the words we had finally spoken and the quiet truth they carried. I told myself he might not come. Perhaps he would think better of it, convince himself that what had happened was a mistake, something brought on by sentiment and twilight. And yet, when the clock struck 4, I heard the gate creak. Daniel was there, dressed neatly, a faint nervous smile on his face. He lifted his hand in greeting. I hope I'm not early, he said. Never, I replied. You're exactly on time. We walked to the garden, where the roses had nearly finished their season. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of fallen petals. Daniel crouched to pick one from the path and twirled it between his fingers. Funny, he said. Everything's ending, but it still looks beautiful. I nodded. That's what endings do. They remind us to notice what we have. He looked up at me then, and there was something unguarded in his eyes. Is that what last night was? An ending? No, I said softly. I think it was the beginning of honesty. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world seemed to narrow to the space between us. The sound of his breath, the way the wind lifted a strand of his hair, the fragile quiet that comes when words no longer suffice. When we went inside, the house felt different. Warmer, somehow. He sat at the table while I poured tea, our usual ritual, though our hands brushed when I passed him his cup. It was a small touch, but it felt charged, alive. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. I thought about what you said, he murmured. That you care about me too. I looked at him, unsure whether to smile or look away. I meant it. I know, he said almost to himself. It's just, no one said something like that to me in a long time. Something in his voice, the gentleness, the quiet ache, undid me. I reached out without thinking, resting my hand over his. His fingers froze for a heartbeat, then turned slowly beneath mine, fitting there as if they'd always belonged. We sat like that in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock and the steady rhythm of the rain beginning again outside. Eventually he whispered, It's strange, isn't it? How safe it feels here. Safe, I repeated. Yes, that's the right word. He looked up, and there was something luminous in his expression, a mixture of gratitude and affection that made my chest tighten. You make me feel like I can just stop pretending for a while. You never have to pretend here, I said. Not with me. That was when he moved, slow, uncertain, giving me every chance to step back. I didn't. He reached across the small space between us, and his arms came around me in a tentative, almost shy embrace. It wasn't the desperate kind of hug you give when you're falling apart. It was steady, careful. Two people meeting at the same quiet frequency. I could feel his heart against my chest, quick but steady. It felt like warmth returning to a room long left cold. We stayed like that for a long time, saying nothing. His shoulder was damp from the rain, his hair smelled faintly of the outside air. I could have stayed there forever, memorizing the simplicity of it. No expectations, no fear, just the quiet fact of being known and accepted. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright, though not from sadness. "I didn't mean to overstep," he said softly. "You didn't," I replied. "Sometimes words aren't enough." He smiled, and in that smile was all the light of the season, brief but brilliant. "I think that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "Then you've been listening to the wrong people," I said, and he laughed, a quiet, honest laugh that felt like music in the small kitchen. We spent the rest of the afternoon in gentle conversation. He told me stories from his childhood, how he used to race the post train along the fields near his hometown, how his grandmother used to bake bread that tasted of sea salt. I told him about the first class I ever taught, about the students who'd filled the room with questions and dreams. Between stories, there were pauses, long, comfortable silences where the sound of rain or the crackle of the fire seemed to say everything we couldn't. When the light began to fade, Daniel stood reluctantly. "I should go before it gets dark." I walked him to the door. The air outside was cool and fresh, the rain now a mist that clung to our clothes. He hesitated on the step, turning toward me. "Thank you," he said. "For all of this. For not pushing me away. You gave me something I didn't know I was missing," I replied. He tilted his head. "What's that?" "Company. The kind that feels real." He smiled a little sadly. "Then I'll try to keep showing up." He started down the path, then stopped halfway and looked back. "You know," he said, "today felt like the kind of day I'll remember when I'm old." I chuckled softly. "And what will you remember?" "That I wasn't alone," he said. "Not even for a moment." He waved once, then disappeared down the lane. I stood there long after he was gone, the evening settling gently around me, the scent of rain and roses in the air. For the first time in years I felt something blooming again, quiet, patient, and unmistakably alive. That night I wrote a single sentence in my journal. Sometimes love begins not with a kiss, but with the courage to stay when the world goes quiet. I closed the book, placed it by the window, and listened to the rain until sleep came, peaceful, certain, and full of tomorrow. Autumn slipped into winter with the kind of gentleness that only small towns know. The trees along the lane shed their leaves, the air turned crisp, and the first hints of frost began to gather on the garden gate each morning. Life for most people carried on as usual, post to deliver, fires to light, bread to bake, but for me something subtle had shifted. The house no longer felt quite so empty. Daniel kept coming. Not every day, his routes took him across town, and the winter weather made travel slower, but often enough that I began to expect the sound of his boots on the gravel. I no longer counted time in days or hours, but in visits, in cups of tea shared, in the small smiles that passed between us without the need for words. One cold morning I opened the door to find him standing there, cheeks flushed from the wind, a wool scarf wrapped awkwardly around his neck. "You'll catch your death in this weather," I said, ushering him in before he could argue. He laughed as I handed him a towel to dry the snow from his hair. "You sound like my grandmother. She must have been a sensible woman." "She was," he said, smiling. "You'd have liked her." He followed me to the kitchen, stamping snow from his boots. I poured tea, the only cure I knew for the cold, and we sat by the fire, watching the flames curl and breathe. "Does it ever get lonely for you?" he asked quietly. I looked into the fire. "It used to. But lately, no. Not so much." He smiled at that but didn't say anything more. The silence between us had changed. It was no longer heavy or uncertain. It had become a companion, a place where we could rest. The weeks passed that way, full of small rituals. He'd bring me the morning paper or a loaf from the bakery, and I'd insist he stay for tea. Sometimes we talked about everything, sometimes we talked about nothing at all. Once, he brought his sketchbook again and showed me a drawing he'd done of my house. "You made it look better than it is," I told him. "Maybe," he said. "But that's how I see it. The light, the garden, the open door." There was something in his tone that made me pause. "The open door?" I asked. He nodded. "It's what I think of when I come here. You never close it too quickly." That simple remark stayed with me all evening. I realized he wasn't just talking about the door. As winter deepened, the world outside grew quieter. On some evenings, when the snow fell thick and the town seemed far away, Daniel would stay late. We'd light the oil lamp and read by its soft glow, Sometimes poetry, sometimes the newspaper, sometimes nothing at all. He had begun to leave little things behind. A glove, a pen, a folded sketch, as if to remind me that part of him remained even when he wasn't here. One night as we sat by the fire he said, "I used to think home was a place. Now I think it's a person." I looked up from my book. "And have you found that person?" He met my eyes with quiet certainty. "Yes." The words filled the room like warmth, settling into every empty space I'd once carried inside me. I didn't respond right away, I simply reached across the table and took his hand. That was enough. The townspeople of course noticed our friendship. In small towns nothing stays private for long. The baker would smile knowingly when Daniel bought 2 pastries instead of 1, and the grocer began to ask after your young postman friend. I pretended not to notice, but I felt no shame in it. Let them talk. There was nothing wrong in finding comfort where it was offered. Still, there were moments of doubt, quiet ones that came in the middle of the night, when the fire had burned low and the house creaked in its sleep. I would ask myself whether I was being selfish, whether I was asking too much of someone whose life was still beginning while mine was gently winding down. But every time I started to retreat into those thoughts, Daniel would return, smiling, steady as if to say, "You don't have to question this. I'm here." And slowly I began to believe him. One morning in the first light of spring, I woke to the sound of birdsong. The frost had melted, and the air smelled faintly of earth and new beginnings. I opened the door to find a small envelope on the doorstep, my name written across it in Daniel's neat, careful handwriting. Inside was a single page folded twice. "You once told me that endings remind us to notice what we have. But what if this isn't an ending? What if it's the middle, the part where 2 stories meet and decide to keep going together? Thank you for the tea, for the quiet, for the space to breathe. You've given me more than kindness. You've given me home. D." I stood there for a long while, the morning light spilling across the letter, my throat tightening around the simple, perfect words. Then I smiled, slipped the note into the pocket of my coat, and walked down the path toward the lane. The air was cool and bright, the sky an impossible blue. At the bend in the road I saw him waiting, satchel at his side, hands in his pockets, that same shy smile that had started all of this months ago. "Good morning," he called. "Good morning," I replied, feeling the words settle warmly in my chest. For a moment we just stood there, facing each other in the sunlight. The world around us hummed quietly, the sound of leaves stirring, of a distant bell, of something beginning again. Now, when I think of Daniel, I don't think of longing or distance. I think of the way light falls across a letter on the table, the scent of tea, the soft knock on the door that still comes, rain or shine. The house is no longer quiet. It breathes with laughter, conversation, shared moments, with life. Sometimes he still teases me for being too formal. "You write like a professor," he'll say when I leave him notes on the counter. And I'll laugh, telling him that old habits die hard. But there's one note I'll never change, the one I wrote months ago and kept tucked inside the drawer of my desk. The same one I once feared to give him. Now it doesn't feel unfinished anymore. Feels true. There are people who arrive like morning light, quietly, gently, and all at once the room changes. Every morning when he steps through the gate, I'm reminded how right those words still are.